So advanced work packaging, I've included the surfboard slide, which people that are familiar with AWP for short will recognize, to try to ground everyone in what is it and what's the point of it. So for some background, about probably 10 years ago now, there was a joint initiative launched by COA, the Construction Owners Association of Alberta, and CII, Construction Industry Institute, looking at this. So the work-face planning, the yellow surfboard on the right, was sort of invented or applied in Alberta in some of the oil sands projects. And then CII had a lot of research in the front end, so front end loading or engineering procurement, that kind of thing. So the two groups got together and launched advanced work packaging. The key points of this are it's really a structured framework to maximize construction productivity. That's really the goal of it. It also has a lot of other benefits. It costs less than a traditional approach, better safety, better quality, and there's significant research done by CII to quantify the benefits. But on the slide there, the important piece is really it's around the path of construction and determining that. So you see the POC in the middle of the blue slide, and then the CWPs are construction work packages and engineering work packages, and then you get into work-face planning when you have individual work packages. So and then startup work packages. So that's kind of the basis of it. And it's really designed to optimize start with the end in mind and optimize the earlier parts of the supply chain so that at the end of the day, when you get to what are called the installation work packages, which is about 2 weeks of work for a crew to install, they have everything they need to be very efficient. So that's kind of high level what it is. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how do you apply it on projects with contracting structures. So a little bit more background. This is a CII best practice. I was on one of the research teams, RT272, that did some of the research on it, and I wrote the contracting piece of the research. So I'll be presenting some of that work again. It was originally published in 2013. All right, can we go to the next slide, please? Really quick break-in. So we've been having some chats on internally, but just so you know, for Q&A, please go to Slido. It's #CII and ask your questions. You can also click on the thumb if you see a question you think is important and you'd like to second or third or fourth that, and that will raise it to the top of the list, and at the end we'll answer your questions. So, so these are what are called tools and templates for AWP. The detailed tools and templates can be found in the RT272 Volume 2, the implementation guide. But I wanted to give a high-level overview of them because I'm going to talk about them later on in my discussion. But the one on the left is called an AWP audit tool by Phase. So essentially, depending on where you are, whether it's in front-end loading, detailed engineering, procurement, into construction, this is a tool to help you to score, how well you're doing implementing advanced work packaging. And it's very important, as you'll see in some of the future slides about contracting, to know how well you're doing. Then there's the second tool is called the Project Definition Assessment Tool. And all that is really a way to self-assess how ready are you to implement AWP. The next tool is a qualification questionnaire, and it's only 10 questions, and it's really designed to supplement your existing qualification questionnaire that you have to help you understand how qualified or how experienced or what is the capability of a contractor or company to do AWP. And then last but not least is what's called the maturity model. So you can kind of see 3 columns on the maturity model. There are 3 levels of maturity in doing AWP. One is level 1 is early stages, level 2 is AWP effectiveness, and level 3 is business transformation. So it's baseball, not golf. The higher level is more advanced. So you're really going to need that maturity model both to self-assess your company and self-assess or assess suppliers to see, how mature are they in their AWP journey. So these tools will come into play in the future when I talk about contracting. All right, can you go to the next slide, please? So another high-level slide. This is also available in the research, the implementation guide. Essentially, it talks about the different plans, progress managements, and assessments that need to be done when implementing AWP, and it has some different contractual delivery structures. So it talks about the feed by owner, feed by contractor, and then the different phases. And then there are numbers that kind of explain who's responsible for creating that plan or deliverable. The brighter colors are really around what's unique to AWP. So if you weren't doing a traditional delivery system, you were doing AWP, that might be specific for AWP. And then the other ones are, you would do these plans anyway, regardless of what kind of delivery you're doing. But you supplement some of those plans with AWP information. But overarching, it's really around the AWP execution plan. So that's sort of the roll-up plan that includes all the other parts of AWP and how you're going to implement it. And I'll go into a little bit more detail why that's important later. Next slide, please. Excuse me. Okay, so this is a rather busy slide, but I thought what I would do is kind of bookend how hard is it to implement AWP. And when I say hard, there are levels of hard, but some delivery models are more conducive to practicing AWP, some are less conducive. So when you start on the first row there about scope delivery model, and it's really, when I say harder, it means that the delivery model or the criteria has more interfaces and it's less centralized control. So the more interfaces you have, the more coordination you have to do, the more handovers you have, the less control you have, the more difficult it can be to implement advanced work packaging. So that's really the gist of this. But and as you heard from my colleagues, because there's such a spectrum of delivery models and there's a lot of different types, I tried to bookend it, and then depending on where you are in the middle, there could be some nuances around that. But the first one talks about, you see feed, EP, PC, DBB. I mean, it's a lot of acronyms there, but what I'm trying to say is it's harder if you have like a feed and then an engineering and a big P is like procurement of the big items or tagged equipment. And then you have a separate constructor. So a little p would be bulk materials or other small items. Design, bid, build is very similar to that in the commercial construction industry. It's easier if you have one contractor that's doing front-end engineering design and engineering procurement and construction. That would be kind of a design build mode in the commercial construction. Integrated project delivery or alliance, so more collaborative, generally centralized control. It makes it easier. On the compensation, lump sum or fixed price can be more difficult, whereas reimbursable or paying gain share is easier. And most of that has to do with, on the lump sum, in general, what you'll see on some examples that I provide is that you really have to define the work. And then once you define the work and you get a price and you award the contract, you want to minimize changes and stay out of the way to let the contractor execute efficiently to avoid claims. So what you'll see is that it really requires a contractor that's more has more experience doing AWP if you're going to do it lump sum, and a lot of that has to do with if they're less experienced, then instead of treating implementation of AWP as a benefit or something that can help them deliver better and reduce risk, they may treat it as a risk, and they might add money to their price. Easier on reimbursable. Construction approach, some contract or construction management at risk. That can be harder because you have the individual subcontractors and you have to evaluate how well can they implement AWP. You have to coordinate all their work and make sure that they don't step all over each other. Whereas with a direct hire where the EPC contractor controls the construction labor, or a general contractor in commercial construction where they control the construction labor, it's easier to implement because they're naturally managing the interfaces, and ideally they have a centralized approach to work package generation. On the value realization, so with a competitively bid type system or a lump sum system, the market forces are where you capture the value. So you capture the value at contract award if you're from an owner point of view, and then you preserve the value through execution by ideally having minimal changes and not, if you define your scope well and you hired a competent contractor, ideally they'll deliver on the deal and they'll deliver as promised at the price promised. Whereas with the FPSO Alliance or reimbursable, the value capture is really during construction, right? So you invest upfront through planning and implementation of AWP, and then during construction, the contractor is efficient when they're doing the installation, and as a result, the savings are shared or they go to the owner. Whereas, as I said previously, with a lump sum, ideally, if the contractor is sophisticated in their AWP application, then their bid price will be lower because they understand the efficiencies that they can gain, and as a result, the price to the owner will be lower. With plan development, in design bid build, it's series, so you develop an AWP plan during feed, and then you hand that over to the designer, and then you hand it over to the constructors. So it's harder. It's less collaborative, and it's more difficult to get that construction input that's so valuable. Whereas with FPSO, ideally you're getting the construction input early. As those of you that have worked with construction before, you know that depending on who your constructor is, there's a lot of, well, I have a way I'll do it, and I'm not going to take somebody else's plan and execute that. I'm going to do it my way. We call that not invented here. There's a lot of that in the culture, and so if you have the continuity, it's much more efficient. On the supply chain, ideally, it's harder if it's decentralized. So we say furnish and install. So a lot of times the subcontractor will supply and install the steel, for example, or supply and install the plumbing or the piping. Whereas it's easier if it's centralized because you have control over the supply chain. You can issue the engineering deliverables to the supply chain following the path of construction as it will be installed. So there's more control over that versus having to manage it later. On the design tools, harder with paper or non-integrated, easier if it's centralized or free issue. Lots of tools around managing supply chain, but very important to coordinate it, and it can be hard to herd the cats if you don't have the centralized supply chain. On the AWP adherence, so how do you make sure that the team is actually doing AWP? For lump sum, it's really compliance and compensation. So I'll get into that a little bit more in the example, but it's really around the contractors providing an EPC, or excuse me, an AWP plan, getting aligned with that, documenting in the contract, and then making sure that you link that to compensation so that they follow the money. It's easier in reimbursable or alliance, where you can provide direction, use the audit tools, and improve. And then on maturity, with the lump sum or the design bid build, you really need a level 3. So otherwise, it'll be suboptimal. Whereas with the easier, you can probably get by with a level 1 or 2 if you have a strong owner that's really steeped in AWP and how to do it. You can bring contractors along in the journey. Can we go to the next slide, please? So I've done an example. So after doing kind of the bookends, I've done a quick example. On the left, you see the key enablers. So I talked about AWP maturity level. So that's using the maturity model to determine where you are on the journey. With an owner, you probably want, again, this is the reimbursable feed EPC. So one contractor. Generally, the one contractor is selected very early in the process and then continues on throughout project delivery. So you have minimal handovers, and you ideally will get the construction input from the actual group that will do the construction early in the design process. So because you have that single point of responsibility and you have maximum control, ideally it's simpler to implement AWP. So you can have the bidders at a level 1. A lot of times we'll do pre-qual and we'll ask, well, do you do AWP? Oh yeah, we do it, blah, blah, blah. But what we find is, when we're from Missouri and we say, show me, sometimes it's not quite as robust as they claim. But it is possible and easier to bring a contractor along just because they're not carrying risk money, and the owner is really carrying the performance risk for the most part. You get the construction leadership continuity. So that's really a plus. If you're doing direct hire, it's even better, just because you have total control over when you bring people on, the planning of the installation work packages. So there's a big benefit to that from an AWP standpoint. You develop the plan collaboratively, so you don't necessarily get a plan up front, an early feed. You just kind of test their tools, their systems, their people, their experience, and then together you build the plan after contract award collaboratively. So there's a lot of benefit from that. These last two, schedule and AWP terminology. So I mentioned the engineering work packages, the construction work packages, and the installation work packages, and the startup work packages. And you might have procurement work packages if you use that terminology. So all these work packages, you need to put your schedule in that terminology. So that way everybody's kind of on the same sheet of music. You're not sub-optimizing, where engineering is delivering their deliverables how they would normally do it, and then you're having to kind of re-optimize for procurement and then re-optimize for construction. That's the whole point of AWP, is that you're all kind of aligned on how you're going to deliver the project, and people are working on things in the right order with the right priority to support the construction effort. And then finally, it's really important to specify your IT plan, your digital plan. Regardless of which software packages you use, you really ought to do that as early as possible to make sure that everybody is integrated, and that you're not having to bring somebody on who's like out in left field with respect to the IT plan, and that can be very disruptive. So in the compliance assurance, I mentioned the audit tool. So that could be a joint effort where you go through and do an audit, you do a score, take the corrective actions and implement them. On the management commitment, very important. You will do AWP. We're committed to doing it. And as an option, you could link a bonus to the AWP audit scores. So if you get a score above a certain amount, contractor, we're going to give you a bonus payment as a reward. And then the tools on the right, I've already gone through those. So let's go to the next slide. So now I'm going to cover lump sum, competitively bid lump sum, EPC or fixed price. So really important to have very mature owner and bidders in AWP. And I think I said earlier, again, if the contractors are less mature in AWP, then they will look at it as a risk versus a benefit or a delivery assurance tool. And as a result, you will have probably higher bid prices where they will include contingency money to learn AWP. Or anyway, it will likely be a higher price. Very important for the owner or the owner's engineer to employ a robust AWP and feed in the front end, because that will really, again, the path of construction, you're going to put that in your documents. The construction work areas and the engineering work packages or engineering work areas, you're probably going to include that in your documents that go out to the bidders. Now the bidders may make adjustments or changes, but you're really setting the basis during feed. So very important to make sure that is done well. And then compliance, you have the bidder supply the AWP plan with the bid, and it should be linked to the schedule that's in AWP terminology. And then you also link that to the payment schedule. So the way you get compliance is they provide their AWP plan. You get alignment with that during the pre-bid or the bid phase, clarification phase. You put that in the contract, and then you link that to the payments. So for example, if they're going to develop so many engineering work packages, you might have a mixture of progress payments and milestone payments that are linked to that effort, and that'll be aligned with the schedule. So they're executing using AWP, their progress is being tracked using AWP, and they're getting paid based on how they follow AWP. So all of that, follow the money definitely helps for compliance. It's less likely on the AWP audit tool. You may do that with them, but at the end of the day, they're responsible for delivery at the price and schedule specified in the contract. And if they don't follow AWP, that's really on them. So again, you could consider some payments linked to AWP scores maybe as a benefit to try to incentivize them to do that. On the contractual requirements, a lot of people get kind of hung up on what are the contractual requirements. Do you have any documentation? I'll share with you that ExxonMobil's contractual requirements for AWP are 4 pages. So clearly it leverages heavily on CII's AWP research and terminology, but it's not a lot of additional requirements. So we're able to implement AWP without a lot of going in and doing open heart surgery on your contract documents. So I've included a little note in small print that you might not be able to see, but it also says, hey, just because you're doing AWP doesn't mean you need to throw the contractual basics out the window. So if you're going to do lump sum, there are some prerequisites that need to be in place before you attempt that. And I think that is the end of my material on AWP. So I think it's time for a break.
So so what is this thing that we're calling a quilt? Okay, so we'll show you that. So the quilt is, oh, there he is. Okay, so the quilt is not only something that keeps you warm in the winter, but is also a way of visually expressing, usually in a table format, how the scope of a particular project is allocated to the various parties. And so it's a part of your contracting strategy. It's not the whole thing. Typically, the contracting strategy deliverable is a document that has a quilt in it, and the quilt just helps make understandable what should otherwise be not easily understood in writing. Picture worth 1,000 words. So what we've done here is we've developed 3 quilts that we think are relevant to the people who are attending today. One is for a chemicals project. Another is for an upstream project, and I'll be doing one in the infrastructure sector around a P3. So with that start, and seeing that Paul is here, we shall start with Paul's quilt, if that's all right, Paul.
Yeah, that's great. Now that I'm back, sorry, had a technical issue.
Go ahead.
Right. Shall we move to the next slide? So what? This is around a kind of a pseudo-real chemicals project, and it seeks to kind of zoom in on the middle part of the spectrum. So if we look at the next slide, please. So this is the slide that Richard shared earlier, and the example I'm going to touch on is kind of in covering somewhere in the red box, shall we say. There's a little bit of everything in it, and I think Richard and Keith will touch on a couple of other items at the extreme ends of the spectrum, both left and right. But it also will intend to show how we build up a quilt, but also comparing different options in quilts, and then what happens when you get feedback from the market, which I know some of the questions that are coming in I've also kind of touched on that. So hopefully there'll be a little bit of insight from this discussion as well. So if we can move to the next slide, please. So just to give an example, it's a US chemical plant. It's an expansion of an existing facility. The capex is in the kind of medium range, so it's not small, but it's not a mega project. It is on an existing site and facility where there's an infrastructure and existing suppliers available, and there is significant activity ongoing in the same region or area. So there's quite a few other projects and activities ongoing. And a request for information, you may also call it request for proposal or an early expression of interest, was used to validate the capability of the supply chain, their experience, their availability, and their interest. And that was against a set of selection criteria that have been discussed within the wider team. So Richard mentioned earlier about having that multidisciplinary team. So it's really, well, it's a good practice, and I would almost say it's essential that you get all the key stakeholders in the project involved in setting that criteria. Whilst, yes, this is a supply chain or a contracts and procurement led process, it's essential that you have your key stakeholder buy-in, and that would at the very least be the project manager or director, but also key participants in the wider team, such as, in the oil and gas industry, health, safety and environment is obviously a table stake. Your engineering team, the site operations team, particularly on an example like this where you're working on an existing site with the potential to impact the asset, and make sure you've got the buy-in from all of them around the selection criteria. And in this example, there are 4 key selection criteria, which is a competitive cost, an optimum, not necessarily a fast schedule, that the contracts are attractive to the potential suppliers in the market, and that the number of interfaces is minimised. So those were seen by the kind of say the wider project team as being the key items that they felt would influence success for this particular type of project. Next slide, please. So what you see here is that the scope is essentially split into two elements, and apologies, I think the text at the lower is not very clear, but it's ISBL, which is inside battery limit. So that's kind of main process plant scope, and then you've got OSBL, which is outside battery limit, and that's usually connections to existing infrastructure, utilities, or other auxiliary systems that may need to be constructed to support the wider process plant. And typically, an inside battery limit scope can be packaged up in one area, one location, or one common type of process. It's also the type of scope that lends itself to offsite build or offsite fabrication and then brought to the site. Whereas the OSBL scope tends to be more tied into the existing site and is smaller and more spread out and more distributed scope. And usually on an existing site lends itself to being executed by contractors with experience already of the existing site. So there were three initial quilts considered prior to the engagement of the request for information. And you can see on the left an example of the spectrum. So you sort of start with kind of multi-factor selection, and then further down you might think about category management, and then more sole sourcing, and I'll explain about that a little as I go through. But on the first one, this is a feed EPCM. I think Keith mentioned earlier, sort of a rollover where a contractor is picked early. They execute the front end engineering design. They will help to provide an estimate for final investment decision or appropriation. And then they'll continue and do the engineering and procurement of the scope. And they'll be asked to do construction management oversight of construction contractors. However, the construction contractors would be separately tendered, and those could be tendered mainly, in terms of the activity by the EPCM, or maybe leveraging existing relationships with the company. But what you'll see on the right is it kind of indicates that for each of the scope areas, ISBL or OSBL, you may have a different contractor for each of the main trades or the main discipline areas. I've simplified it a bit here. There'll be a few more, but in the oil and gas industry, we tend to focus on the four major trade disciplines of mechanical, electrical, instrumentation, and civil. That's just kind of shows you that you have kind of one overarching contractor, but then a number of the separate civil construction contractors. The second is maybe the similar to design and build, or design bid build, I should say. And this is essentially you do your design and then you tender for a lump sum engineering, procurement, and construction contract where all the risk is with one party. So very simple in terms of interfaces, but has other disadvantages, and probably the main one is that it can take quite some time to develop the feed, then tender the feed, and then once the feed scope has been awarded to an EPC contractor, the EPC contractor would then typically want to do what's called feed verification to be comfortable that they understand all the technical aspects of the scope prior to starting, and that can add anything up to a year on the schedule. Then the third alternative considered was to spread the risk a bit more and maybe have someone do the ISBL elements. That could potentially open up the opportunity, particularly if you've got fabricated modules. So one variant here could have been that they could have selected the construction was actually fabrication, and then with minimal site construction contracts. So there would be an extra element of the quilt for fabrication here, and then the OSBL with a separate contractor. And in this particular case, it could have been that your OSBL EPCM would be someone who has experience of that particular site, whereas the ISBL EPCM could be a different contractor, and this opens up the opportunity to have more competition and potentially manage resource constraints or resource issues. But clearly on this one, it has the most colours. This is probably the one that looks most like a quilt, and therefore you can see that interface management would be one of the weaker areas there. So you see on the right hand side the 4 key criteria that I mentioned in the previous slide. So cost competitiveness, optimum schedule, marketability to the supply chain, and minimization of interfaces. And in this case, I've done a relatively simplistic assessment, so red, amber, green traffic light. Usually the assessment methodology would be a little bit more sophisticated. We probably don't have time to go into all the various methods here, but there are various methods ranging from simple evaluation against a score of 0 to 10 to multivariable, multi-factor comparative evaluations. So there's a range depending on the complexity and the variability, and that usually is most successful when done with a range of stakeholders who may not all have the same perspective, and you get a bit of objectivity into the process. Now, interestingly, when they went out to the market, they found some challenges in getting enough attractiveness for the 3 base options, and actually they concluded that a feed EP where they went out early with a feed contractor who then continued to do the engineering and procurement, and then having one overall general contractor to do all of the execution work turned out to be a more attractive option. And in the next slide, I'll just elaborate a little bit. But this is really just to show you that you can consider different options and different breakdowns. It would be well informed by a market assessment, and in this case, they had a preliminary view, and then they went back out to the market with an RFI to refresh the understanding of the market, and also to assess the risk profile of the different options against the suppliers a little bit better. If we go to the next slide, please. So I'm just going to elaborate on how some of that decision making may have been made. So the RFI concluded that the site and the EFA, it's maybe a shell term, but it could be also called GFA or MSA. So it's a enterprise frame agreement, can also be a global frame agreement, regional frame agreement, master services agreement. But it essentially means that you have a call-off contract with a dedicated supplier for a period of time for either a given location or a given type of scope. So in Shell, we have them, for example, at our major refinery and chemical plants, but we also have them in the corporate offices for specific types of scope, like offshore or LNG. So the RFI results concluded that the incumbent EFA supplier was actually stronger than any of the other respondents, and there was quite a number of other respondents. They also confirmed that the pricing was competitive, so there was already pricing in the frame agreement, benchmarked that pricing against the market, but also that with that pricing, the quality of the staff were actually better in terms of who was available already than people that we brought in from the market. The option of using the frame agreement enabled a portfolio approach, so they could use the same supplier on more than one project that was happening at the same time, and also it allowed them to prevent the need to do a bid for feed and EPCM. Yeah, so in this case, it's certainly attractive on schedule. You could argue, could they have got a better bid? Maybe, but the indications from the RFI were that it was positive. So I think already I mentioned that the tendering would add to the schedule, and then it was also verified via the RFI that the incumbent supplier had sufficient capacity to support the project. There were others who had capacity, but it meant also that this option was not a concern if it was to be selected. There's an option to use either the engineering and procurement and construction company or a general contractor for managing direct construction. So in terms of issues on the construction side, you could either go with a large construction-focused contractor or one with a more EPC, which gives some flexibility even if you minimize the interfaces. It opened the option for a performance-led contract, and I'll come on to that in a second. By using the frame agreement, it enabled improvements from previous projects and previous relationships to be delivered on this project. And that allows both parties to be aligned on delivering top performance, which we call top quartile. So I think in retrospect, or in reflection, when you look at what the RFI showed, that there was no compelling reason to go for any external suppliers in terms of pricing, availability, or capability. It had advantages in terms of schedule and spend on contracting, and it brought opportunities in terms of learning and behaviours and relationships and replication. Now that may not be the case. If you'd done the RFI, you could have found that the supplier that was incumbent was very tight on resources and couldn't grow. And for example, in real life at the moment, in one part of the world we're working on, we've worked on a similar basis, but we now see that the incumbent supplier has kind of reached their capacity for ongoing projects. So we will have to look elsewhere. And then maybe you find when you do the RFI that external suppliers have good experience in that particular type of project or that particular type of operating environment, and they could bring in a more attractive proposition. And particularly if you look at a modular approach, you may find that alternative suppliers have a better leverage in the global supply chain to deliver a fabricated solution. So I think that's why it's important to you test the market, you test your strategies, and then you recycle and then weigh that up against the drivers of success and also the risks that you see in the project. So I'm just going to finalise now on one last slide on the outcome, and this kind of I've obviously tried to anonymise this a little bit, but this gives you a feel for the sorts of things you can achieve. So if you go to the next slide, please. So I already mentioned that the contract strategy moved from a kind of 3D PCM to a separate EP and C contractor. Actually, out of that relationship, given the extent of the relationships that had already been in place, both with company and the two separate contractors and between the contractors, a wider alliance contract developed kind of organically from the arrangement, and a set of shared targets and incentives were developed, and there was a strong focus on a one-team mentality and a common behavioural charter between all parties. And all parties bought into a cost target for the whole project that they then would share rewards on. It turned into, outside of contractual lines, a natural integrated project team who were completely aligned on safety, were fully co-located, and actually started to really make a step change in the application of digital project execution. So a number of best practices were identified and deployed that are now becoming the norm. The outcome was a significant reduction on the cost target. It was delivered ahead of schedule, and the safety was best in class. So, considered to be a real reference benchmark project. And those particular contractors then were kind of seen as the initial base case for any similar project work in the region. Subject to that market assessment and availability assessment I mentioned earlier. And it may be a useful one to finish on here is that, there's, I think many people would in the oil and gas industry would have heard of IPA. They talk about repeat supply chain projects where you work with predominantly the same suppliers. And you know, what they found is these are usually a natural evolution, not necessarily a forced selection, which is this is a good example of, and relationships and maintaining continuity of not only the contracting company but also key personnel are key to success. So in this particular instance, that reflection with the market, really looking carefully at what was available, really helped to refine it, and it shows the danger maybe of doing a theoretical approach without validating in the real world. So, but hopefully you see there's elements here of kind of EPCM, EP plus C, and then leaning a little bit towards the performance-based contract, but that a more traditional lump sum approach was also on the table, and that was worked through the contract strategy process. So that's my example, relevant to the chemical sector, and probably relevant for any kind of major onshore facility where there's an existing infrastructure. Could be oil and gas, but you can also reflect on it for a building expansion or a hospital expansion, train station, etc. So I think it would have similar elements. Yeah, so I think that's this one finished. I'm not sure if it's Richard or Keith that's picking up the next one.
That's Keith.
That's right.
Great, thanks.
Sure. Next slide, please. So I'm going to cover an upstream project, and it's an offshore project. Next slide. So the facilities are on the right. So you can see what's called a FPSO, a floating production, storage, and offloading unit. So essentially that floats on top of the ocean. All the production goes to that, and then it's transferred to a tanker to go to either an onshore facility or to market. So in that FPSO, you have a hull, which is just the bottom of the boat, the top sides, which are the top piece, and then seabed moorings, which are those lines that hold it to the seafloor. And then what's under the water is called SURF. So subsea umbilicals, risers, and flow lines, or SURF for short. So you can see the trees and controls, which are go to the wellhead. You have some injection wells, which are essentially when the production comes up to the FPSO, it separates out the gas and the produced water, and then that's compressed or pressurized and re-injected into the well to get more flow of oil. And then the green parts are the trees where at the wellhead, and then the flow lines and risers. The flow lines kind of connect the facilities on the seafloor, and then the risers go up to the FPSO. So what does this look like in a contract quilt? So you can go to the next slide, please. Next slide, please. Okay, so you can see this quilt's a little simpler. In general, fewer boxes is better because you have fewer interfaces. So on the left side is the activities, and on the right side are the facilities, and at least that's how we do the quilt. And then if you see like a big box that goes kind of straight down, like that EPC1 box, we call that a vertical split. And if you see a box that kind of goes across, like that EPC3, we call that a horizontal split. So it goes across the facilities. Then you see, so this one is pretty much the owner does project management. So that would be ExxonMobil. We usually have one feed contractor that will do the front end engineering design. And then we split it up by the FPSO and the SURF. In general, because there aren't companies that do all of that, but you would also need to consider, so you can see that for the FPSO, you have the hull, top sides, and mooring systems. Is there an integrator? So there's one contract, so one of the contractors is the integrator of all that. Even though the hull is built in a shipyard, the top sides might be built in a separate yard, and then the mooring system might still be separately somewhere else. you have one contract with one contractor, and it's their responsibility to manage those interfaces between those different components. You might choose to have 3 separate contracts if you want to have more control, but in general, we try to have as few interfaces as possible. On the risers and flow lines, there's one contractor that does that plus the installation. On the umbilicals, manifolds, jumpers, and trees and controls, there's a contractor that essentially supplies the kit or does through fabrication. And then there's one contractor, the separate one that does the risers and flow lines, also will install those out at sea. So why would you have fewer boxes or more boxes? Well, if you have these contracts and they're too big, when I say too big, it's either scope or amount. The market will form joint ventures or partnerships to spread the risk, either from a financial standpoint or from a scope competency standpoint. So you need to decide, do you want that to work with a joint venture entity, or do you want to work with one or multiple contractors directly? So you need to make that decision. Other reasons are often local content. So where we operate, often the resource owner wants local content so that their people are benefit not only from the sale of the resource, but also learning skills and trades and jobs. So we may have smaller contracts where we want to attract companies that are local. So you might have more contracts than you normally would, just to leverage the local content. Other reasons could be around financial requirements. So oftentimes we borrow money from lenders to build these big projects, and the lenders have some requirements that they want as a condition for borrowing their money. And sometimes it could be, the national bank of a country says, hey, you have to buy this much, material from our country. And, oh, by the way, here are these other constraints that you need to comply with. So often we will write those into our contracts, and they could manifest themselves in a more complicated quilt. Last but not least, on this one, this is all offshore, but oftentimes our projects have an offshore component and an onshore component. So you might, instead of having an FPSO, maybe you do have the FPSO, but you have a pipeline that runs from the FPSO to, or whatever the type of facility is, to the shore, and then you have either a power plant or some distribution center on shore. So that would have a more complicated quilt with even more contracts on it. So we'll move on to Richard and his P3 example.
Thanks a lot, Keith. Okay, so we thought we'd include a component from the civil or infrastructure world. So I chose a P3 project that I had familiarity with for a couple of reasons. First of all, it is sort of a unique model that we haven't discussed, and it's perhaps a bit on the outside of what this group is used to. And second of all, it's trending, let's call it, and so it might be useful to see an example of one. Okay, so if you could advance the slide, Stephen. So in this case, this is a major transportation infrastructure build. There was this is a series of towns in the prairie provinces here in Canada, and there was a big road that went through a number of small towns, and there was just so much traffic, in particular because of the truck traffic. And there was far too many accidents that were happening, and also it wasn't very fast. So there was some challenges here from a safety perspective and also from an economics perspective. And so there was a decision to create a bypass to cause the major highway in Canada, which we call the Trans-Canada Highway, to go around these population centers. And so this required the building of a large amount of new infrastructure, in the form of 12 bridges or overpasses and about 500 kilometers of new roads. And then there was a bunch of upgrades to that which was existing. So the capex for this was 1.8 billion. That's the value for money after a value for money calculation, which we'll get to shortly. And the model was a design, build, finance, operate, and maintain. So the P3 can come in a number of different flavors, and so I'll quickly review some of those. But that was this particular model. And the RFQ methodology, which is a request for qualifications, was used in advance of an RFP to sort of narrow down the scope of the consortium that did the work. So the work was 4 years of design build work, and then about 30 years of operating maintenance, which basically was the initial life of the asset. Selection criteria, the typical thing for P3s, and oftentimes government procurement in sort of a let's call it an alternatively financed or alternatively procured in Canada anyway, and I think as well in the US and in the UK, is that you have to create a calculation, do a value for money calculation. And certainly then the decision here is about best value and not necessarily the best price, although sometimes they get conflated, frankly. So other things were the approach to partnering, because that's a key thing here in a P3. We are talking about collaborative methods, and the P3 approach does have some teaming activities that need to take place at the front end in order for it to work. Other things that were figured in the decision were design and construction approach and experience. Specifically, people have done P3s for roads, and then operational maintenance approach and experience, which is really about taking care of these assets. The financial capability, obviously, the cost of these projects is large, and the cost and the financing is essentially provided either by lenders and or the financing arms of some of the construction companies, and so obviously you have to do some analysis there to make sure they can take the weight. And then there was some points awarded for innovation in terms of things that I think would reduce the long-term cost of operating the asset. And then lastly, schedule or delivering on time, which is always relevant in a public context where people are being inconvenienced on the road. So if we could advance the slide. Okay, so this is a typical design, build, finance, operate, maintain project setup. The organization in the middle, we call that a project co. In the US, sometimes they call it a concessionaire, which is oddly French, and sometimes it can be an operator as well. So you can see multiple iterations of that name. So the owner basically gives the entire scope over to the project co, but not only do they give the construct and build over, or sorry, the design and build over, but also all the financing responsibility, all the operating responsibility. The owner is pretty much just hands off, and you'll see that in the contract quote. And so the project co will its members will put equity into the project to support the execution of the project, and then may also take on debt. And so then there's usually some kind of a bank or similar financing institution where we put the money into the project. And then lastly, design. The project then the project co tends to then separate the design and construct and operate and maintain into components of itself. And the sense is that some of the project co group will do design and construct, so there might be say 5, 6, 7 of them, and then a part of the group will do the operate and maintain. So if you could advance to the next slide, that would be great. So here's a contract quilt. Frankly, had trouble fitting it all on one page, so I left the financing part out. I figured that wasn't as important. But you'll see here that the scope is split up into 3 main areas: it's building new stuff, upgrading what's already there, and then operating, maintaining, and what's being called a rehabilitation. So I divided up the scope here in terms of the various groups of activities. So, we've got 2 highways together, 12 interchanges together. In a different context, it would probably be much more detailed, but again, we're constrained by the number of slides. So the owner really only retains scope over the result and payment of incentives. So that's it, really. It's very, very high level. They'll take ownership later, but it'll be 30 years later, so it's probably not worth describing here. The project co is essentially the project manager for every aspect of this scope. And then you'll see here that the design and build contractor, which in this case was 4 out of the 6, have the new upgrades and the new construction and upgrades together as a scope. And it's typical for them to then download that elements of that scope into their supply chain. So in this case, fabrication, there was a ton of fabrication of bridges, which obviously, they had to go to a bridge contractor or subcontractor for that. And same with the build of those bridges, and so that's called erection. And so obviously they didn't do that part either. And then similarly with the rail and the flyover and the upgrade. So there's certain things that they get subcontracted out quite a bit, and others that the construction, the designers and construction companies can do themselves, or essentially self-perform. And then on the other side, the operate and maintain, similar situation, smaller number of organizations participating there, and far more subcontracting. Obviously, these organizations, they're not going to be in the business of creating signaling equipment. They're not going to be in the business of managing drainage or doing cleaning, snow removal, ice removal, salting, all those types of things that you need to be concerned about with the road. But they would potentially be knowledgeable and have capabilities in aspects around the pavement and the surface of the road. And so this is how the scope was split up. If we had more time and a less two-dimensional context, we could drill down to the next level where each of these scopes would be divided up in even greater detail. But we have we do have some time and space limitations here. If you could go to the next slide. So you will have noted that these contracts are performance-based. So that makes them a unique form of contract, not necessarily equivalent to the ones that you saw in the spectrum that we shared earlier. But I wanted to comment on a few things that result from the type of procurement and contracting method. So first of all, P3s are often done by government or publicly owned or tax-funded organizations, and so because of that, they tend to be political, and these arrangements are very complex. So basically, get ready to hire a bunch of advisors. So P3s, they always have legal advisors, they have fairness advisors, they've got insurance advisors, they've got financial advisors. There's all sorts of advisors involved in these arrangements. And the main thing that one has to do here, and from a public law or policy perspective, is that you have to show competitive neutrality. And that means that you're not selecting by a tendering methodology, which is sometimes required by the public sector policy environment, where you have to have the lowest cost compliant bid, and that's the only way that value could be generated for the taxpayer. And that's a default position for a lot of government buyers. The idea here is that the advisors in a value for money estimation have to show that this method, the P3 method, was better than it would have been if it was tendering, meaning that you have an exception to tendering because this other form of alternative procurement and financing methodology is better. And so then that's why we didn't follow our policies. So that's a big part. A couple of other things that one notices when one is in these arrangements. Project co's tend to have a lot of bargaining power with their suppliers, and they actually will, even though the owner gives them the risk, and they're supposed to, and the theory is that the contractor is supposed to best manage the risk. In fact, what they tend to do is then shove it down to their subcontractors, and they often do that through tendering arrangements for the lowest compliant bids. So that tends to kind of pervert the whole purpose of managing risk in the right place and emphasizing upfront planning and relationship. So there's a little bit of sucking and blowing going on at the same time with respect to the benefits, the ostensible benefits of these methods. Because on one hand, you're using upfront planning and collaboration and efficiencies, so that, you know, by providing the whole scope to one organization, and on the other hand, you're throwing it back out the window as those organizations try to you know, sort of capture the largest margin possible. And one of the behaviors that I've noticed is that the project co, where in these performance-based contracts, they have incentives, but they don't share them with the subcontractors who are often performing the work. And so then they can then the subcontractors can care quite a bit less about the oftentimes schedule targets that lead to these incentives, and then that can lead to conflict and sometimes claims. So these models, generally speaking, in the project that what I'm describing here, there was a 17% benefit, or $380 million in supposed cost savings, which was assessed by a specialist advisor whose job it is to create value or to show value for money's been created. But at the same time, there's also probably some costs that were a more collaborative approach could have been avoided. And so with that, I think we could move to questions. I don't think we have any more slides, actually. Yeah, correct. If you could advance the slide. We're at noon here, so there may be some, oh, we have the golden nuggets, right. Okay. So why don't we do the golden nuggets really quickly? And then Bob, how do you want to handle the questions?
Yeah, I think what we'd like to do is let people have lunch, come back after lunch, take questions, and then Paul will finish with his piece. So you go ahead and do the golden nuggets. Okay,
sure. Very well then. So some of the golden nuggets, and so I welcome my fellow panelists to come on. So Paul, feel free to join, and I know Keith, maybe your camera's still out. So the key thing here is with the golden nuggets here is do it early, do as early as possible in your contracting strategy. It's not a one and done. So the expression there is that you will often test your strategy against the market, and sometimes the market won't accept it as it is or won't accept parts of it. And so then you actually have to, after that response, you actually have to adjust it. And so then it's sort of a living thing that that has to change with market circumstances. And then I'll let Paul talk about the team effort, since the third and this is the last two bullets are sort of on that topic.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. Yeah, I think I mean, I did emphasize it earlier that multidisciplinary nature and making sure you don't have biased views by getting a broad perspective, and also thinking about the different items that may be you know, a requirement or a challenge for the given project or effort. Yeah, so you know, someone from HSE or someone from finance, etc. You know, all giving their perspective. And maybe one thing we haven't included here that I think is useful to reflect on is getting that good understanding of what are the objectives and the success criteria and the risks to those, and using that team effort to really assess the robustness of the selected contract strategy to deliver the outcomes and manage the risk, and then verifying that, you know, with the market. And with the example I showed, you saw that by doing some market testing, it did update the thinking which I think reinforces the earlier points of by doing it early, it gives you the time to go and explore the market and test, and indeed that's a good example of why it wouldn't be a one and done for a significant part of the subset of projects that are done globally. Keith, do you want to add on the last point?
Sure. So another point is that there was a Slido question about, do you get some of the suppliers involved early? And the answer is yes. Oftentimes during the conceptual phase, we'll ask for some of the contractors to come in, and we'll kind of share our thoughts with them and see what they think. We make them sign their life away that they won't talk about it with anyone. But in general, we get their execution opinions. Like we pretty much say, look, keep your business development people at home, bring your execution folks, and those are the people we want to talk to. So bring them in. And then on the do it early part, the point behind that is that we really want, the reason we do it early is we want to avoid making decisions that foreclose options later. So for example, if we're doing in the downstream chemical area, if we're doing a technology license where we have to go to a third party and get a license to use their technology to develop a unit, occasionally those licenses will have restrictions that say, well, you can't, share this technology information with other competitors of ours, which will restrict your bid slate downstream. So you might need to make a decision earlier about who do you want to construct it, or maybe consider a design build. That would be an example of that. Finally, the contracting needs to support the project execution strategy, not the other way around. So come up with your project execution strategy first, and then make sure your contracts support that execution strategy, which is linked to your drivers. What's the project objectives? Is it speed to market? Is it lowest cost? Is it, what is it? So make sure that they're linked to the project execution strategy.
Yeah.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back. Hope you're able to get some lunch in that time frame. We will open up to address a few of the questions that were asked by people through Slido, and I'll pass this along to members of the team as to who would like to cover which questions. The first one is, will presentations be available? Yes, this whole thing's been recorded, and so it's going to be available to those people who registered for the conference, as well as through the CII site. And as far as individual slides, you can talk to the person whose package it came from if there's something that you would like that's specific other than just the recording and being able to see the slides. Another question was, is there a template or generic example of this control strategy document that can be shared? Paul? Keith?
Yeah, I think most companies have their own kind of structure format. I think probably between myself and Keith and Richard, we can come up with a generic approach that we can share. But there are a few differences in how each company approaches it. But I think we can probably put together a small go-by with the key elements that you would cover in a slide deck or a strategy paper.
Okay, thank you. A couple questions here about maintenance. During a planned outage with capital and maintenance work, what are your thoughts? One single contractor doing the work versus two or more contractors?
I'll take that one. I'll give you the all-encompassing answer. It depends. At ExxonMobil, when we do what we call a turnaround or an outage, in general, internally, we plan that for like 3 or 4 years before it actually happens. And then the unit may be down for, you know, anywhere from 1 to 2 months. So because we're doing all the planning, we usually like to we're pretty much paying the contractors for labor. They follow our schedule and our work plan. If you're able to ring fence the area or provide, you know, minimize the discovery work, then you might actually be able to pay one contractor or bid. We did that a couple years ago where we had 2 units that were very similar. Actually, they're exactly the same. It's like 2 trains of the same process. And we had one unit came down first, and we lump sum the second unit. And with the bid slate on the second unit, we let them observe what we found when we opened everything up. And as a result, when the second unit came down, we were comfortable lump summing it. So you can do that if you can isolate the capital piece from the maintenance piece and minimize the permitting issues.
Yeah, maybe I'll just add to it a little bit. Kind of funny story in one of my early experiences in the late 90s. I was a maintenance engineer, and then was asked to be the turnaround leader whilst implementing project scope all in the same plant. So I was wearing kind of 3 hats at the same time. And yeah, you saw the benefit when the same construction contractor who knew the area was doing the execution work. We actually had design work done by 2 different contractors, and we ended up with interface issues as a result. So yeah, I think as Keith says, it's as we'd say in this part of the world, it's horses for courses. But on the other hand, you know, building on previous experience and minimizing interfaces and what's generally a very stressful and complex environment, in my experience, always helps. But you know, that all comes down to the planning up front, and you know, looking at the factors we mentioned about, you know, availability, continuity, and other work that's ongoing. Because when you've got major shutdowns, you probably will have a lot more people than you would normally have on site, and so you're going to have new people there regardless. So maybe the best you can get the consistency of is at the foreman or the supervisor level.
Okay. Next question we've got, and these are multiple people asking, can you detail the difference between bill of quantities and unit price models? It appears both are remeasurable. Go ahead.
Yeah, I saw that one there. I was tracking the questions. So yeah, it's a bit of a subtle difference. A bill of quantities is where you've got very discrete elements, you know, so a flange, a piece of pipe, in the civil side, a bit of rebar, you know, a unit of concrete. Whereas a unit rate is where you might have a combination of those to come up with an overall package. So an integrated foundation, which has both rebar as well as the casting of the concrete, as well as the digging of the hole that goes into. For a pipe, it would be the isometric or the spool. You know, it might be you know, a T or you know, a specific connector, you know, and you would tend to group it into what would be more typicals that would be the larger building blocks rather than each individual element. Yeah, so in that respect, there's a little bit, it's not as deterministic. Bill of quantities is extremely measurable. The unit rate sometimes has a little bit of kind of factors and elements intertwined, but it is much simpler to audit and less intensive to measure. So that's kind of the trade-off between the two. And yeah, there are a few examples in industry. I mean, most of my experience is this side of the Atlantic, but certainly in the civil trades, NEC has quite a number of ICE has quite a number of these type of unit rate contracts with the compounds. So hopefully that helps clarify.
And it's important to understand what's in the unit. So, for example, is construction equipment in the unit? Is scaffolding in the unit? Is supervision in the unit? Like, what's in the unit?
Yeah, great clarification, Keith. indeed. You know, it's almost what do you make up, and how much is overhead versus direct as well. Yeah.
Okay.
Sometimes it's necessary to hire a third party expert to try to figure that out.
Yeah, and it's called a quantity surveyor, somebody who kind of counts the units as they're installed. You hire one of them as well.
Okay, moving on. When different EPC contractors work in a brownfield project, sharing areas with operation, how do you manage risk of interferences which may impact project ops?
Good
Sounds
question.
sounds like somebody's been burned.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, challenging area. I started my career in brownfield projects, so I recognise this question. Few different treatments. I think one is wherever possible, if you can segregate your working environment from a permitting perspective, so that you're not subject to operational permits. So, for example, in a couple of projects I've been on, there's been temporary fixed detection systems put in place, either for toxic gas or for flammable gas, and that means that having you know, a portable gas tester under permit wasn't required, and it was then allowed to be treated as a construction permit rather than an operating permit, and that allows the constructor to have a lot more predictability on productivity and workfront management. So that's one area. Another is if you've got critical tie-ins to operating plant, doing those in a dedicated campaign, either during a turnaround when the plant is down, and having an isolation area to connect, again means that you're managing the work front in a focused way and in a more predictable way, rather than trying to do it individually. There's a softer side to this, which is communication. You know, you've got lots of different contractors coming in, maybe some that are unfamiliar. It's really important to build that relationship with the operations team, and make sure there's a clear understanding around what their requirements are, and ideally have that input prior to placing a contract, so that you understand the constraints, and the contractor can price for it, or you change the form of contract to allow for it.
Okay.
So I've had some experience with this with a brownfield. It was a train upgrade, and the trains were still running through the construction site. And every time a train would come, everybody who was anywhere near it had to stop work. It really had an impact to project schedule. And part of the issue was around that communication is that the trains were run by, you know, the folks that run the train, the city in this case, and no one had really engaged the city very well on the train schedule. And it took forever to get the train schedule finally, because they didn't want to share it because of security reasons, and also because it changed a lot. They didn't necessarily want people to realize how the trains weren't necessarily on time. So definitely some of that communications and engagement with all the stakeholders that comes, in my view, from executing a good contracting strategy. In this case, they did not do it. And then the other thing was really just around this idea of planning. They just needed to replan a lot of the work around the train schedule, which previously was not part of the plan. So all the plans had to be rewritten to some extent because of this.
Okay. I think the next question was answered later in the morning. So let's skip down to what is normal contract strategy for maintenance, outage, turnaround, lump sum, time and material, or other?
I would say it's normally time and material, for the reason that I discussed previously, or what Paul discussed, is that often the owner does all the planning, and then there could be some significant discovery work, and generally the owner wants control. So the owners, because the plant's down for a certain number of days, the owner wants to be able to control that and make adjustments in execution if it looks like we're falling behind or there's more discovery work than planned. So there could be some significant uncertainty. So that's not a really good fit for lump sum. I mean, you guess you could do unit rate, but in general, you're demoing things and then installing replacement parts or new things. Typically on these turnarounds, the advantage is that the thing works because it worked before. It's not like a project where it could be a surprise and it doesn't work. It's generally going to work, but occasionally there's some larger than expected discovery work, and you really want to be able to make adjustments on that.
Yeah, I fully agree, Keith. Maybe just a point to add, which I think you touched on earlier as well. Someone also asked about, the involvement earlier in the process of contractors. So a good practice I've seen is, and I think Keith mentioned, you plan these turnaround events, 2-3 years in advance, is getting early selection of your contractors, maybe on an area basis, and having them heavily involved in the planning and the preparation. Yeah, so that they're understanding the issues. They can see where it's straightforward and where it's complex, and that gives you a joined up approach and an aligned approach on how best to for example, get early access to equipment that you're concerned about that has maybe more discovery work and can get that out quickly, and what's the low priority items or the easier to get at items that you can fit in, somewhere during the middle of the work. So that early contracting involvement, I think, is really helpful.
Yeah, and apologies for the fact that wasn't a normal contracting strategy, but actually a choice amongst many possibilities.
I'm going to skip down to another question that is related to that. What is the normal contracting strategy for capital work that is non-outage work, that is well defined with a solid scope of work?
I would say anything that's well defined, and well understood, is you're tending towards some kind of fixed pricing method, whether it's a lump sum or unit rate or something like that, but where you have a lot of information, you have a high degree of information, you can stay away from sort of what I would call variable pricing models, because they might actually end up being more.
Okay.
Maybe, Bob, maybe I can just answer one of these questions. I've done a lot of turnaround events, and I think I guess I'd like to leave everybody with their open mind here. It's not always one or the other. I mean, I've written some long-term contracts where we do integrated project work with the turnaround. Every project, typically in a brownfield community, has some kind of integration into a turnaround. So we actually went with a contractor that we were a long-term relationship with, so maybe a maintenance contractor or whatever, and then you put together your contract based on man hours. So basically both the owner and the contractor both estimate the man hours, come up to agreeable man hours. Obviously discovery work gets added to that as you go through a turnaround, but what this also allows you to do is put incentives and penalties into place around, productivity, quality, safety, etc., attendance. It drives the workers, and those incentives typically would go direct to the worker and not to the company. So, you can think outside the box here. There's a whole bunch of approaches, and I call that very collaborative, right? I mean, the benefit was if they beat the man hours, then we paid them 1.5 times their rate. If they went over the man hours, we only had paid them 50% of their rate. So, there's an incentive on both parties for collaborating.
Good. The next question is, can you give an example of a hybrid model between EPC and IPD?
Yeah, so that would be the EPC with an open book pricing, in my view anyway, where you have a lot more disclosure around margin and profitability, and in that sense, it's hybrid.
Okay. How do you use historical data to quantify the risks in one approach or the other?
what tools do you have? You know, risk analysis, you know, is a function of tools. If you've got a simulation tool, then your chances of quantifying accurately are a lot higher.
Okay.
Or you might go to a third party like IPA or some kind of benchmarking firm to get data on other projects, maybe done by other competitors, to understand, and then compare that to the projects that you executed. If you've done multiple projects using, you know, differing strategies or compensation, you could do a twinning study.
Yep.
You know, if you do internal cost estimates, then you kind of know what you thought it would cost and what it ended up costing, so you can do a reconciliation. There's lots of methods.
Yeah, yeah, and maybe just to build on that, you know, we've just done a study with IPA, kind of precisely looking at that. So what's the comparison of the choices of types of models to the outcomes? So, you know, they have quite a wide you know, information set in general. We did it also specifically on shell projects. It does show that maybe there's no silver bullet, as Jay mentioned earlier, related to turnarounds. I think Keith mentioned as well. But you know, I think it's always difficult to get the precise context to see why something was either a success or not. But there are a few trends, and I did mention, I think earlier, one of the key areas that IPA have seen has been really successful is when there's repeat projects with naturally partnering companies kind of evolving over time.
Okay. Next question is, I'm unfamiliar with oil and gas. EP&C looks like design, bid, build. How can I design, bid, build, and EPC both be medium on the spectrum?
I'll quickly take this. So part of that answer is really just the amount of space there is on a slide, and fitting all of the different acronyms into the one slide. And so I apologize if there was some, you know, basically just fudging of these things. But many people see design, build, and EPC as being corollary to each other, one in non-industrial and the other industrial. And it just so happened they ended up being medium on the spectrum. But in my view, that's probably an oversimplification. And really, it depends on how they're executed. If they're executed in a more collaborative way, then they're going to tend towards the other end of the spectrum, and or vice versa.
Yeah, the spectrum's not to scale. And I'd also say that when we get into collaborative contracting, that kind of extends the spectrum quite a bit.
Okay. We have time for about two more before we'll turn this back over to you, Paul, for your piece. What mechanisms ensure materials are properly included in the contractor's scope so there's no duplication in purchasing, or worse, gaps in material scopes?
Well, if you do advanced work packaging, that will definitely help that.
Yeah.
Other ways to do it is you tell them what you're providing, and then they have to provide everything else. We've done that. Here's the list of materials that I'm providing, free issue. You need to provide everything else, or it's furnish install, which means they provide, the subcontractor provides the materials as well. Oftentimes we'll have, for low value items, we might have bins like gaskets, nuts, bolts, that kind of thing, versus dedicating them to work packages. But I guess the furnish and install is probably the easiest one, where they need to provide everything.
Yeah, I mean, maybe it's an old adage, but, you know, completing your engineering before you start to do the activity, which is maybe AWP in its most simplistic form. But you know, not running too far ahead and then finding you've got crews on standby. and indeed, so a good quality feed before you go to execution, a good engineering scope before you go to procurement and construction, should work out. I think the other one is for those commodity scopes, ensuring both company and contractor has good call-off arrangements with major suppliers and stockists. So focus your early work on complex equipment, but when it comes to bulks and commodities, make sure you've got good flexibility in the supply chain.
Okay. So going on, do you consider lump sum and fixed price as interchangeable terms? I've seen some tax differences based on the selected terminology.
So in my view, fixed price is distinct from variable in the sense is that the quantum or the dollar quantum is not moving. So I would see lump sum as a species of fixed price. There's other forms of fixed price like unit rates, and in fact, lump sum can have a number of things that are fixed and variable, but they're rolled up into one amount, which is not the same as fixed price, which doesn't include a variable component. Anyway, that's my view. I'm happy to hear what my colleagues have to say.
Yeah, you have what they're called provisional sums, for example. There might be some elements of a lump sum that you just have a placeholder value for, and then based on more information, whether it's actual pricing or more engineering definition, then you might fix the price at a later date on that component, and then you make an adjustment from the provisional sum. So that would be part of a lump sum, whereas firm price or fixed price or firm fixed price. And as you say, it could be the jurisdiction you're in. I mean, they could have a definition for tax purposes that could be different. So, definitely talk to your tax lawyer. Don't take my word for it.
There's a question about procurement work packages.
So this is an interesting area. So there's been some recent research about supply chain and AWP. Right. And the output of that research was that procurement work packages are one of those optional things. Some companies use them in their process, some companies don't. So it's an optional thing. It depends on what your company does.
Okay. Since owners are dictating comp structures via their RFPs, example lump sum, doesn't that circumvent much of the analysis and benefits you are describing?
Yeah, I mean, the answer to that is yes. It could be that the owners have gone through an exercise where they determined that lump sum is the best pricing strategy, or it could be a compensation model. But it could be that that it's not well thought out, and that there's an impression that lump sum is going to lead to the lowest cost. But it could be only because they're not looking at the total cost of ownership. They're only looking in the instant costs of the project, and that's it. So like usually within just a shorter time frame.
Yeah, I mean, a very typical question for larger projects I would ask in an expression of interest or early engagement phase is, what's the maximum amount of project scope that you would be comfortable to do as a lump sum? And as a sole contractor or in the oil and gas industry and consortia. And that then helps you to shape the number of parties you may go to, or whether lump sum is appropriate for the scope that you want to do. And maybe you carve out some parts of the scope as lump sum and others as more reimbursable approach. But I think the point about the early thinking on your contract strategy and market testing before you go to a very firm approach with an RFP would go some way to helping you structure your RFP in a way that the market is most likely to accept in line with your other value drivers or selection criteria.
So for your last question here, I'm actually going to combine two questions. One that I saw that's a little later. What do you do when the market rejects your strategy? And then secondly, what do you do when you're operating overseas in a country that has little understanding or expertise in AWP?
Well, if the market rejects your strategy, you recycle and come up with another strategy. You can't cram your strategy down the throat of the market. They'll either refuse to bid, they'll take a bunch of exclusions, or they'll give you a price that you don't want to pay. And even if you do choose to pay it, it probably won't turn out well because there's a reason they're rejecting your strategy. So in general, you would recycle, which is one of the reasons you want to test your strategy early with the market and see, if there's a lot of reluctance or not so sure I want to bid on that basis, would you consider doing it this way versus that way? You really need to take that into account. And if the market doesn't accept your strategy, you have to recycle. And then on the AWP question, you can do components of AWP. Like for example, you still, if you just do construction work packages versus installation work packages, you still package the work. It's just a bigger package. And in general, with the construction work packages, they'll often still follow the path of construction, and they'll still be, trade specific. Like you'll do a civil package, a structural package, like that. So it still helps to organize the work and package the work, even if they won't do the rest of the work phase planning piece. So there are components of it you can do, or you just choose not to do it and go traditional.
Okay.
One last remark about if the market rejects your strategy, you might want to, if you're concerned about that, you might want to include a little bit of contingency in your project planning, so that you can, communicate effectively to a PM why they're going to take some schedule delay on the procurement or contracting activity, because they may decide that there isn't any time to quote redo it. If you haven't communicated on that in advance, then you might be stuck.
Okay.